Hi, Bradley. Oh,
Hey,
how are you?
good. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. Thanks so much for coming and for joining. You'll see a lot of people kind of starting to join on Zoom because it's spring break. So some people, or spring break
Haha,
tomorrow, but people are
nice.
traveling and still wanted to be here. So there's some of us in person and then some online.
Cool.
Yes, yes.
How
But
big how big is the club normally?
So in total, I think last time I checked, we have 61 people enrolled, and then there's people like on various sports teams that can never make a meeting but watch the recordings. And then in person, I guess we have like 24, I think has been the max in person. So
That's awesome.
pretty good. Like I'm good with that number.
Yeah, no kidding. This is the first year?
It's the first year, first semester. So this is week 7. Yeah,
Cool.
yes. Okay, let me just make sure. Yeah, all the recording is good. Perfect. Well, Bradley, we can, get started whenever you would like, whatever timeline works best for you. And then, of course, we'll have Q&A and such after. Leave it up to you to guide.
Okay. Sounds good. I don't mind waiting if people are going to be trickling in on Zoom for a couple minutes.
Sometimes, yeah, we'll see. I feel like normally at like the 15-minute mark, people come in and I don't want to make you wait that much. But yeah, then we'll always have the recording to go back later.
Root
But I watched a little bit of your talk on was it Monday or Tuesday?
Tuesday, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that was great too.
Cool. Yeah, that was the job was to summarize a 120,000 word book
Yeah.
and I thought it was 45 minutes, which seemed really, really hard. And then I got an email Tuesday morning that said 30 minutes so that I could leave time for Q&A. And I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm
Yeah.
just going to skip all the negative stuff
Yeah.
and just do the positive stuff because I'm doing the negative stuff on Thursday anyway with you
Yeah. Yeah.
guys.
Yes. Well, we have an hour, so I think you have plenty of
Perfect.
time for whatever
Yeah.
you need to cover. Yes.
Cool.
Awesome. Yes. And then we also might get so Cornell Bitcoin's kind of the guinea pig of the Bitcoin Students Network that we launched earlier this month. And so we also might get some people in the network, not at Cornell, join the Zoom. I know Kevin is here as well. So that's kind of another fun thing you might notice in the
Awesome.
participants. But yeah, I'll turn it over to you for
Oh,
whenever.
a heart emoji from Kevin. Great. And how many, so obviously the club and the network are focused on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Is everyone who's involved Bitcoin only, or are there people who are, you know, interested in Bitcoin but also interested in other things?
Yep. So the club, and to be an official node in the Bitcoin Students Network, needs to be Bitcoin only. Like in the first week of this club, for instance, we went over like we called it like definitions day, I think, like what is Bitcoin, upper lowercase, what is money, what is blockchain, kind of set the differences. So at least it was, spoken about, established. But then, from here on out, everything is Bitcoin only. And then one of the kind of pillars of BSN is a funding track if you want support in your club, and we will have kind of a set of criteria. It has to be, for Bitcoin only purposes, and you're a Bitcoin only club to be eligible. But I don't know. I think we probably have now in the hundreds kind of engaged and involved. And so it's hard to know if every single person is Bitcoin
Right,
only.
of course.
But at least what is spoken about and shared is Bitcoin only.
Wow. That man, you've done so much in such a small amount of time. That's incredible.
Yeah. Have a good team.
Yeah. Good job to all of you. Let me see. I can share screen. Okay, cool. I'm
Yeah,
gonna
yeah,
share
you should be able to.
screen. Let me see. All right. Do you see just the slides or do you see
No, I see your whole screen.
the whole screen?
Oh, like the whole screen.
Okay, including
Yes.
my book manuscript, which I may read from
Yes.
at some point. Okay. Well, sneak peek. Let me see how to switch that. Sorry to just throw you back and forth into.
No, it's okay. All good. Yeah.
That just the
Yeah,
PowerPoint?
that's just
Okay.
PowerPoint.
But it's the whole PowerPoint screen, not just the one slide,
Correct.
right? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have no idea how to do that part. So rarely use slideshows, but they seem good.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Perfect. Yeah, no, it's great.
Okay. Cool. Should I start? I see at
Yeah.
least one more person who's there
Yeah,
in the room.
there's and then I don't even think you can see another in the back.
Okay.
But yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me.
Oh,
I think this is an awesome club, and I wanted to help in whatever way I could. And I was like, oh, I could come to Cornell. And then I looked up flights from Laramie, Wyoming to Ithaca, and there were many flights or much driving or whatever. So then I was like, oh, I don't know if I can. And then Alice said, oh, you can just join on Zoom anyway. And
yeah.
now that it's spring break, that's perfect.
Yes.
So I'm happy to be here and support it. And I ran a bunch of different ideas by Ella, and we settled on objections to Bitcoin. And then in the book, so well, I'll get to all the book stuff. Should I just start going, or do you want to say something at the beginning?
No, you can
Ella?
just I'll turn over to you. Whatever works best for you is good with me.
Okay, cool. So this is me. I'm a philosophy professor at the University of Wyoming, and I have recently written a book with Andrew Bailey, who's a philosophy professor at Yale NUS in Singapore, and Craig Warmke, who's a philosophy professor at Northern Illinois University, called Resistance Money, a philosophical case for Bitcoin. And in that book, we evaluate Bitcoin from behind the veil of ignorance, which is a heuristic for determining in economics what sort of rules, social rules you want to abide by. And you can also use it for political philosophy. But in general, it's just a good way of trying to remove personal bias from decision making. And so we suggest that when you step behind the veil of ignorance and you don't know who you're going to be in the world, then you look at all the different people you could be, and you realize that a whole lot of them would benefit from the existence of Bitcoin. And so you would choose from behind the veil of ignorance to step back into a Bitcoin world rather than to step back into a world without Bitcoin, where if you lived under authoritarianism or high inflation, you'd have no recourse to protest or to save. So that's kind of where the book came from. And we've been doing a bunch of podcasts and writing some op-eds in Newsweek and USA Today and that kind of thing. So on Tuesday, I gave our biennial, or I don't know what twice a year is, but we have a faculty senate speaker series here at the university that's you apply for and are you nominated for, and then there's a selection process. But anyway, I got to talk to all of them about Bitcoin, and I gave kind of the condensed version of all of the positive stuff from the book. So if you want all the positive stuff from the book, then you can watch that. It's 30 minutes and I fly through it all. But in this one, we thought it would be a good idea to go over some common objections to Bitcoin. There are a lot of common bad objections to Bitcoin, so I won't necessarily talk about those, but then there are some common, like pretty decent, interesting, worth thinking about objections to Bitcoin. And so I think I have only 4 of them. In the book, we talk about interspersed throughout the positive chapters, we touch on maybe 8. And then we have a chapter called Against Bitcoin, where we give 17 more. But we don't have time for all that. So I thought it would be good to go into detail about some of the better and more common ones, and then just kind of open it up and see whether you have questions about those, or whether, as I imagine will happen, there are objections that I didn't get to, but that you're interested in. I could try to guess a lot of them, but I think it's better to just have you pose the objections in your own words, and then we can all talk about them together. So here we go on to my 4. Now, the theses in the book, and I think the theses of people who believe in Bitcoin, are not just one thesis, but multiple theses. So one thesis is that Bitcoin is money. And money, economists tell us, is a commonly accepted medium of exchange. And so to say that Bitcoin isn't money is to say that Bitcoin isn't a commonly accepted medium of exchange. And usually when you object to that, you're objecting to the commonly accepted bit, and you're giving some sort of data about how many people use Bitcoin. But that's not very interesting to me. I don't care how commonly accepted it is, or whether it's commonly accepted enough. So I'm not really going to consider objections to the thesis that Bitcoin is money. I think the next two are theses that are accepted by pretty much everyone who has a positive view of Bitcoin, and that is that Bitcoin is apt money. That just means that Bitcoin functions well as money, that it is at least a good candidate for being money. Maybe not the best candidate or the only candidate, but at least a good candidate. And then the third thesis is that Bitcoin is good money. And I mean this to be different than saying that Bitcoin is apt money. So you might think of the thesis that Bitcoin is apt money as the thesis that Bitcoin is good at being money. And then the next thesis is that Bitcoin is like morally good. It is a positive thing that Bitcoin is money. So if you consider some characteristics of apt money, like scarcity and size and divisibility, you might come up with the thesis that human teeth aren't terribly bad at being money. They're scarce, it's hard to make more of them, they're easy to carry around, etc. They're somewhat fungible, but not too. Anyway, the point is they'd be really bad. It would be really bad for the world if teeth counted as money. You'd get people prying out teeth to pay off loans, and you'd get people harvesting other people for their teeth, and that would be terrible. So there are situations in which an apt money and a good money can come apart. And so there are theses that say Bitcoin is an apt, or there are objections that say Bitcoin is apt money, but that's really bad. It's unfortunate for the world that Bitcoin is so good at being money because it's morally so bad that Bitcoin exists. And could you go the other way? People that believe Bitcoin is good money but not apt? Not really. But objections to Bitcoin might attack its ability to be money, its ability to function as money. That would be attacking the apt money thesis. And then there are different objections that will attack the good money thesis. So I think it's good to keep in mind what kind of objections these are. The objection to the thesis that Bitcoin is apt money are usually technical objections. And then the objections to the thesis that Bitcoin is good money tend to be moral objections, tease out morally bad consequences. And then the bottom thesis is at least the thesis that we're interested in arguing for, which is that Bitcoin is resistance money. And there are objections to our thesis that are not objections to Bitcoin being apt money or good money. You might think that US dollars are apt money and good money, but they're not resistance money. They don't allow for the right kind of privacy or the right kind of inclusion that is necessary for a money to serve as resistance money. So you might grant the apt money and good money thesis, but then still say Bitcoin fails to be resistance money for the following reason. Maybe it's not private enough or something like that. So I'm not sure. We'll talk about which of the theses, each of the objections that I'll talk about target. But then as you are thinking through objections that you've heard or objections that you're interested in answering or thinking about, I think it's worth figuring out which of the Bitcoin theses each objection targets. Okay, so I'll do a couple. I think probably given the size of the group, maybe we'll just stop after each objection and talk about them if there are any questions, because it's small enough that we can do that. So any questions so far on the distinction between the four theses? Okay, you're going to have to speak up fast, otherwise I'm going to move on.
Brian, did you
Okay.
have a question?
Oh,
Well, I think we might wait. Brian, did you have a question?
sure.
Yeah, okay, we have one from here. You can just talk and I think it should
Could
come
you
through.
just elaborate a little bit more on Bitcoin as resistance money?
Yeah, good. So when we say Bitcoin is resistance money, what we mean is that Bitcoin is an effective tool for resisting the overreach of corporations and governments, specifically ones that tend towards authoritarianism. So Bitcoin offers certain kinds of privacy that allow people to transact outside of the watchful eye of companies who might spy on your data and then sell it or use it to try to sell you more things or something like that. Bitcoin is censorship resistant, so it's very difficult, if not impossible, on the Bitcoin network to block people from, for example, buying megaphones or buying gas masks or buying other things you might want to bring to a protest against what you consider to be an authoritarian regime. It's also not possible to block transactions to things like abortion providers or firearms dealers or any other politically motivated kind of choking off of people from a monetary network. And then it offers financial inclusion. So it doesn't keep people out of the network on the basis of socioeconomic status. You don't have to have a certain amount of money to get a Bitcoin address. You just have to have enough to populate the address with. And you can't be cut off from nobody can say, okay, you're not keeping enough Bitcoin in your address. You need to surrender it. Nobody has the authority to do that. You can't be kept off of the Bitcoin network on the basis of age or race or gender or anything like that. So in this way, it provides the ability for everyone to have access to a digital payments network. So that's kind of the resistance money thesis. It overlaps a bit with good money, but you could have a money that is morally good that it exists, but that doesn't allow for all these ways of resisting authoritarianism and privacy invasion and censorship and things like that. Is that enough? Does that make sense?
Yeah, great answer. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Great question. So objection one is that Bitcoin can't scale. And this is an objection to at least the apt money thesis. Bitcoin isn't a good candidate for being money because it doesn't allow for enough transactions. Does anyone know how many? I'm sure you do. How many transactions roughly per second the Bitcoin network can handle on chain?
I mentioned this the first like 2 weeks.
Is it around 7?
Yeah.
7. Oh, good job. Yeah, exactly right. And how about the Visa network? Anyone?
Remember?
It's hundreds or thousands. A lot more. So if we tried to run the whole world economy on chain, it would be terrible. It wouldn't work. Not enough transactions to go around, not enough block space. So some people early on who were really into Bitcoin took this as a decisive problem, and they said that we needed to increase block size in order to allow the Bitcoin network to scale so that it could still be the preferred payment network for anyone wanting to buy coffee or donuts or any other financial transaction. Did you cover the block size wars at all?
We haven't done that yet. But I kind of have a days in the back on maybe some history. Hopefully we get to it this year. But yeah.
Okay, well then I'll give a teaser, but not go super into it. So the trade-off, there's always a trade-off, right? Every time you're considering adding a Bitcoin improvement protocol or something like that, there's a trade-off, and you have to decide what you prioritize. So one side of the block size wars wanted to prioritize scaling, wanted to expand blocks so that you could fit more transactions in a block. The other side of the block size wars wanted to prioritize the number of full nodes that could be run. How many of you run a full node? Anyway, a full Bitcoin node. Ella, you got to run a full node. No? Oh, okay. So one of the storage capacity to run a Bitcoin full node right now is in the hundreds of gigabytes. And that's with blocks coming at 1 megabyte block limit. The only way to increase block space and number of transactions that can go through is to increase the size of the blocks in storage. And getting blocks every 10 minutes means that if you have, say, a 4 megabyte or an 8 megabyte or 16 or 32 block size, then your storage quickly balloons. And so the side of the block size wars that wanted scaling wanted bigger blocks, which would mean that it would be harder on just normal home hardware to be able to maintain a full Bitcoin node. And that risks centralizing the network. If it costs a whole lot to maintain a full node, then not many people are. And full nodes are what do the validating of transactions and blocks. So every time a user submits a transaction, it goes through full nodes in order to be submitted to miners. And every time a miner publishes a block, it goes through full nodes that check it for validity. So I'm sure you've talked about mining and the mining process. It takes a whole lot of computations to solve one of the mathematical problems, but it takes only one computation to check it. And so every full node can do the computation to check to make sure that the proposed solution to the problem yields a value under the target value. And so every full node does that. And when you have tens of thousands of full nodes, it's really hard to cheat. If you have 5 full nodes, it's much easier to cheat. And so the small block size of the block size wars went in favor of keeping lots of full nodes, but not many transactions. So in that sense, the objection is correct. Bitcoin at present cannot handle enough transactions to run the world economy. Now you might think, well, that's not the point of Bitcoin. If Bitcoin is going to be resistance money, then I don't need to be able to buy coffee with it because I live in the United States and I'm not that worried about who knows that I'm buying coffee in the morning. What's really important and what Bitcoin does need to be able to do is it needs to be able to allow people who are living in other places to buy megaphones and gas masks and things that allow them to protest. And it needs to allow people who are living in authoritarian regimes of all stripes, whether nations or states, to be able to buy things that they don't want the government or corporations to know about. And Bitcoin can do that. Are there 7 of those transactions every second? So you might take that approach in responding. You might say, I don't care if Bitcoin scales. You might also say that Bitcoin is there as an alternative. This would be a good objection if the goal were for Bitcoin to be the only money. And that is some people's goal. The term for this is hyper-Bitcoinization, where Bitcoin just takes over all money roles in the entire world. And if you don't think that that's the goal of Bitcoin, then you might be able to resist the Bitcoin can't scale objection. The third way to resist the Bitcoin can't scale objection is to talk about layers on Bitcoin. Have you done much on the Lightning Network yet?
So the next couple weeks, Elizabeth Stark's gonna come, and then D++. They're gonna give us a full Lightning walkthrough.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll then briefly intro what they will talk about by mentioning that so if we're comparing Bitcoin to Visa, this response to the objection says is we are making a mistake as to how different layers of money ought to function. The Visa network is not final settlement. When I swipe my Visa card at a coffee shop, that transaction doesn't immediately settle. What happens is eventually I will pay my Visa bill and I'll pay it through my bank. And even then, when I have pressed a button on the Chase app, even then, we don't have final settlement because my bank has just agreed to pay Chase a certain amount. And then eventually my bank will settle through something like Fedwire with Chase. And there's these actual funnels of money at central bank accounts that are the final settlement that can't be revoked. And these take a really long time, weeks and weeks in many cases. And this is what interbank settlements do. This is what international settlements do. And these are really slow and they don't process very many transactions. And one of the reasons is because once they do, it's final. That sounds a lot more like the Bitcoin network than a Visa payment does. So if you think of Bitcoin as a base settlement layer, then comparing it to Visa makes a mistake. Now, some people may have hoped early on that Bitcoin on-chain would be able to provide all the layers of monetary experience that exist. And what we're finding out is, and what people should have been able to figure out very early on, is that if Bitcoin is going to get that big, then it's never going to be able to do all of these things. So if you are on the small block side because you want decentralization and you want lots of full nodes, then you just can't think that on-chain Bitcoin is going to fulfill all of these roles. And so people have been working for a very long time on providing layers to Bitcoin. And one of the layers, the layer that I'm far more familiar with than any others, but by no means the only one, is the Lightning Network. And the Lightning Network opens up payment channels between people with on-chain transactions and then shuffles Bitcoin around through these channels by doing off-chain transactions. And the way that it works is ingenious. I never would have thought of it. But you route these payments through various Lightning nodes that have channels open to a variety, and the network finds the closest path. But each node does not know where your payment is going in the end. It just knows where it's going next. So the way that I like to imagine it, and then I see there's a question, so I'll come to that as soon as I say this. I have two kids. We watch a lot of Bluey, and there's this game in Australia and maybe other places called Pass the Parcel. And Pass the Parcel is a gift that's wrapped and then wrapped again and then wrapped again. It's wrapped a bunch of different times. So you can imagine a Lightning transaction as this kind of multiple wrapped thing, and each node unwraps just the top layer. And what they see is a little card that says, send this parcel on to this node. And so they do that, and then that node unwraps it and then sends it on again. And then eventually it gets to the end. And the second last person doesn't know, or the second last node doesn't know that the node that it's sending to is the final node. Only the final node knows that. And so this is a way to use Bitcoin, but in a way that can be much faster. It can process a lot more transactions. It's a lot cheaper, and it scales. Okay, question from Kevin.
Hey, Brett, how do you respond to those BCH people when they say they can run a BCH node on a Raspberry Pi? Because I know the BCH has a bigger block than Bitcoin, and they also cite Satoshi for saying that the block size for Bitcoin should grow with the Moore's law, should grow over time. Right? So how do you respond to those arguments?
Great question. So during the block size war, the side of the debate that wanted more scaling, more transactions, actually instituted a hard fork where they changed the rules of the protocol and made new blocks incompatible with blocks on the classic Bitcoin system. And they named their blockchain and then the underlying asset Bitcoin Cash, or BCH, as Kevin said. And they have a 32 megabyte block size. The current, I'm looking at the current size of the blockchain, it's 221 gigabytes. Nope, that was as of January 10th, 2022. Right now, I should know this. I can't find the block size. If anyone can find the block size of BCH, that would be awesome. Or the size of the entire blockchain. One of the things we see is that the last BCH block was 1.3 megabytes. So the reason that the Bitcoin Cash blockchain is not too huge at present is because it's not being used that much. It's much less popular. If they actually had full 32 megabyte blocks from the time of the fork back in 2017, it would be impossible to run on a Raspberry Pi. It would be very difficult to run on any kind of computer that doesn't have a dedicated external massive drive, or maybe even split. I'm not sure if you do 32 megabytes every 10 minutes from 2017 onwards, I'm not sure how big it would be. But yeah, the reason that it has worked is because most people have thought that it wouldn't, and so they don't use it. That's my response. So the second question was, do we see in Satoshi's original vision of Bitcoin an idea that on-chain Bitcoin would be able to handle micropayments and all the transactions of the world? So there was another much smaller block size war, because not nearly as many people cared, between Bitcoin Cash and another group that didn't like the 32 megabyte block size and thought it should be unbounded. So you should be able to have arbitrarily large blocks. And this was led by Craig Wright, who claimed to be Satoshi and that this was his vision all along. Of course, we know that he was not Satoshi and has never been Satoshi, and the British court declared last week that he was not Satoshi, and we don't have to care about what he says Satoshi meant. So can we see in the original Bitcoin white paper or Satoshi's participation in the Bitcoin forums or things like that, this idea that Bitcoin should be able to do that? One response is, who cares? Satoshi's gone. It's up to us now. And we have a lot more experience with Bitcoin than Satoshi did. And Satoshi had a bunch of incredible ideas, and we are not bound by any of them. The whole point of Bitcoin is that it is decentralized and users get to vote and nodes get to vote. And so we get to do whatever we want. The other thing to say is, I'm not sure that Satoshi meant that Bitcoin would never be layered in the way that it is currently with Lightning and other things. So it could be that Satoshi envisioned everything being done on Bitcoin, but not all on chain. And it would have been beyond Satoshi's ability to necessarily think about how Lightning would work. And someone else had that idea, whereas Satoshi had the original Bitcoin idea. But maybe Satoshi saw that Bitcoin would have to scale in layers like every other payment system has. So that's how I would respond. Is that good enough for you? What do you think?
Yeah, so if BCH has these ordinal garbage on their blockchain, the whole network will crumble down, right?
Not necessarily. It will just look very different than the Bitcoin network. Right now, I haven't looked at the Luke Dash Jr. full node count for a while, but the last time I looked, it was something like 110,000 full nodes. And that means 110,000 people have the storage capacity to download the Bitcoin blockchain. That's obviously impossible on Bitcoin Cash with full 32 megabyte blocks every 10 minutes. So it becomes much more centralized. It becomes a lot riskier. You would want to wait for a lot more confirmations of your transaction. Because there aren't as many nodes to check, you'd get more worried about node coordination in order to try to pass off illegitimate blocks. So I don't know that it would crumble, as in it would literally fall apart, but it would just morph into something very different than what Bitcoin can do.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions about scaling? All right. We can come back to it at the end if we do. Bitcoin enables crime is the next one. This is the one that I get the most. So I'm not sure that it's one of the greatest, but it is very popular. The first line of our book is Bitcoin is for criminals. So we do not run from this. Bitcoin does enable crime. And I think that's really important. The reason that I think it's really important is because not all criminals are bad, and not all laws are good. And I think it's really important to have a kind of money that enables people to do things that their government doesn't want them to do. I think that's a core tenet of freedom, and it's good to have laws, and it's good to have things, have entities that enforce those laws, in my opinion anyway. But it's also important that people have the physical ability to break those laws. So yeah, I think it's true that Bitcoin enables crime. Bitcoin enables crime because Bitcoin is relatively private. There are no identities associated with addresses. And so if you send Bitcoin to someone, it's not known who you are or who they are. And that enables you to buy things that the country that you live in might have laws against you buying. But I teach philosophy, I teach intro, I teach philosophy as a way of life. And in both of those classes, I assign Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. And he makes the point that unjust laws are unjust, and it is not wrong to break an unjust law. You might live in a place where you agree with every single law. That is very rare. And I think it's not hard to imagine the plight of people who live in places where we find many of their laws unjust. And so Bitcoin enables people to break unjust laws. It enables people to break just laws, but that's the price that you pay for having the ability to break unjust laws. And so if we want people to be able to resist unjust governments, we have to have something like Bitcoin. Now, we could try to ban Bitcoin where we think the laws are just, but that would be an unjust law, I would suggest. And so I think we have to allow crime to occur if we want to allow people to be free in authoritarian regimes, or at least more free. The last thing I would say about this is going to be a relatively short one compared to the other ones, is that the ease of committing crimes with Bitcoin is directly proportional to how much Bitcoin you are sending. So Russian oligarchs, there was a concern that Russian oligarchs would flee to Bitcoin in order to evade US economic sanctions. And the Bitcoin network right now is, the value is a little over $1 trillion. People buying multiple billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin gets noticed and gets traced and tracked and pursued. And we find that even with comparatively much smaller thefts of Bitcoin, people are found. The Bitfinex hack that happened, probably some sort of social attack that resulted in the theft of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. US government, Department of Justice officials found 6 years later and confiscated. So the Bitcoin blockchain is public, and you can watch it and you can look at it from the beginning, and there are ever more technical ways of figuring out what's going on there. So while Bitcoin might very easily enable levels of small crime, the larger the crime is, the more that well-funded, well-resourced entities have an incentive to track it down and take it. And as we have seen repeatedly, they are able to do that. So whereas Bitcoin originally started off as a sort of criminal currency, as it got more popular, it became dumber and dumber to try to use Bitcoin for those purposes. And I think the data bears that out as we see headlines over and over again of the US government finding and then confiscating amounts of Bitcoin. So yes, Bitcoin enables crime, and that is good. Is the final word on that. Questions about Bitcoin and criminality?
Yeah.
You said the US government confiscates Bitcoin.
Yes.
Can you elaborate what that means?
Yeah, so it means different things in different cases. With the, if I'm remembering correctly, with the Bitfinex hack, what happened was the US government found out the address that it went to, and then when it got moved from that address to an exchange in order to sell it, they, using laws, not hacking or any technical apparatus, they forced the exchange to hand over the Bitcoin to them. So that's one way that it happens. Another way is that they have triangulated the identity of the person using payments to and from the address. So if they see that a stolen payment goes to an address, they can figure out whether they have the identity of any other address that has ever sent a payment to that address. And they can also watch to see if the address sends it on. So these sort of chain analysis firms and the NSA and can attempt to link a real world identity to an address. And then they can use their standard real world identity tools like FBI databases and things like that to find people. So at least one hack was a guy who had stored Bitcoin private keys on a cold wallet and buried it under his house, and they found it. So one way is to get someone to send you the Bitcoin. The other way is to find the private key storage device and just have that. And whoever has the private keys has the right to move the Bitcoin at the address. And so at least the US government has done both of those things in order to confiscate Bitcoin. What they've never done, and what has been suggested in some New York Times op-eds, is that they've hacked the Bitcoin network and stolen the funds off of an address. That has never happened. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, but if the US government can just grab my money at the exchange, doesn't that sort of defeat the point of decentralization?
Well, exchanges are centralizing entities. So yes, it does defeat the point of decentralization if you hold your Bitcoin on an exchange. Don't do that. And if you have done something criminal and you have reason to think that the government is going to be watching your address, then probably don't send any Bitcoin back to an exchange. Maybe try to buy stuff with it in a way that won't implicate your address or implicate your identity. In general, it's just a bad idea to try to do crime on Bitcoin. And yeah, there are reasons to be worried about the amount of Bitcoin that are held on exchanges. And we don't have any reason right now to be worried that the US government is going to go to Coinbase and say, surrender all of the Bitcoin that everyone is holding on your exchange. But they could do that. And Coinbase could say no, or they could say yes. And it's not clear to me which way they would go. They could, try to use tools to figure out where you live and come to your house and acquire your cold wallet buried under your house, or try to figure out which safe deposit box or boxes across the country you have stored them in, or what trees you have buried them under. They could do those kinds of things. The question is just, is it worth it for them? And that depends how bad of a person you are and how much Bitcoin you have.
Yeah. So Bruno, this goes to like one of the first things I said in our first lecture was Bitcoin's a tool, but then number 2 was take your Bitcoin off of exchanges. It's kind of why. And then also when I was talking about Executive Order 6102 and kind of with all the ETF, all the Bitcoin on those custody and exchange, and all just kind of goes to that point. Yeah. Thank you, Bradley.
Yeah, no problem. One of my most popular tweets said something like, Bitcoin ETFs are not resistance money.
Yeah. Oh, Ryan, did you have a question?
Curious the speaker's thoughts. Some exchanges are even going to start giving interest payments to Bitcoin you deposit, in dollar terms. Would then you see it as if there were incentive mechanisms to leave it on exchanges? How do you feel about that?
I've seen that before. I've seen that on BlockFi, who went bankrupt. I've seen that on FTX, who went bankrupt. So I would be very wary of that. You don't own your Bitcoin if it is on an exchange, and you don't know what counterparty risks your exchange might be engaged in. You don't know what other kinds of risks might be going on. And so, and there's also no FDIC protection or anything like that for any Bitcoin balances on any exchanges. So if you think it's worth it, then I'm not going to tell you how to make those kinds of decisions, but they are by no means risk-free. They incur the risks that I talked about before with confiscation, and they also make you wonder, given that Bitcoin isn't a yield-producing or dividend-producing process by nature, what is happening on the other end such that they can afford to do that? Usually what's happening is they're lending out your Bitcoin. Who are they lending it to? Do you get to know what kinds of assurances are they requiring from the people that they're lending it to? Are they only lending it to one person, or are they lending it to multiple people? Who knows? So I would be quite nervous about doing that. And I'm saying that as someone who has done that and had Bitcoin at BlockFi, and then as rates started dropping, moved it over to FTX, and then as rumbling started happening, thought, why in the world did I ever do this? And I will never do it again. And I have told several people to slap me in the face if I ever start talking about earning yield on Bitcoin. That's not something I wish to do again. Sal, you have a question?
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Bradley, for such a sharing amazing insights. Lived through a couple bear markets here, so I'm yeah, if we don't know where the yield comes from, we're probably the yield. That's something that I survived the 08 crisis as well. So yeah. Anyways, quick question on going back to the first point, really insightful, everything, but I don't know if you remember Elliptic back on October 25th, 2023, published sort of like an insight on setting the record straight as far as there's no evidence to support the assertion that Hamas has received significant volumes of crypto donations. That was to counter specific strategy, sort of an approach that some legislators from the U.S. had to advance a specific agenda. So from a sort of proactive perspective, Bradley, so Elliptic issued that, and then nothing really happened, right? It's what happens after? How can we, I can't wait to read your book, but how can we become how can we help, the truth? Sometimes the truth always helps kind of bring to light the truth, but it takes time. So with this particular insight, since Elliptic came through and they issued this very detailed report, but then nothing happened. And what happens after? How can we help sort of continue moving forward with the truth? What have you seen that is effective at our college graduate school level, would you say?
That's a great question, and it is not a Bitcoin question, but it is maybe an applied philosophy question about sort of social epistemology and social trust. And I don't know the answer. People are motivated to say bad things about Bitcoin, whether those bad things are true or not. And I think in order to get the truth out there, there has to be a change in the incentive structure for the people who are parroting the untruths and then refusing to correct the record afterwards. And I'm not sure how to do that. You can't get someone to care. Well, I mean, you can, but I don't know how. Get someone to care about, telling the truth about something if they're motivated not to. So somehow we have to change the motivations. And one of the ways I've been trying to do that, at least with the sort of political party that I identify with, is to point out to them that by and large, their base is young and people of color. And that is also primarily who owns Bitcoin. It's the younger generation, and statistically, younger people own a lot more Bitcoin, or a lot more younger people own Bitcoin than older people, and a lot more racial minorities own Bitcoin. So their base is invested in something that they are trying to I don't know, legislate against, basically. And that seems like a bad idea politically. But I mean, if their only motivations are political, then that's really the only thing that you can appeal to. And then when it comes to the New York Times, who are publishing these kinds of things, I know even less about how to change their incentive structure. You know, cancel my subscription. They're not going to notice. Post or comment on the articles. So yeah, I don't know, but it's a good thing to think about. And I believe that my co-author Craig Warmke's next book project is going to be at least in part about this. So it's why is there so much misinformation, and then how can we fix it? And so stay tuned for that.
Thank you, Bradley.
Sure.
BlackRock and Larry Fink help too. So that's they're helping right now. Thank you very much.
That's true. Enlist people with microphones to tell the truth on your side. I don't know how strictly we're held. This is only 9 more minutes. Is that right? I don't know how strict you want to be with that. I'm fine to stay longer.
If you're fine, then that's great. I mean, I think if people like, if you have to get to the airport or something, you're welcome to head out. But no, just want to be respectful of your time.
Yeah, sure. I've got I blocked off my afternoon. So,
Oh,
well, here are the maybe just for the sake of other people, I'll do one of these two, and then
Okay.
you know, if people want to stick around. So something about proof of work and why it's bad versus whether Bitcoin is right wing or not. Have you done stuff on mining and proof of work and proof of stake, or is that on the agenda?
a little bit in the beginning, I guess. Do we want to take a vote on which one?
I want to hear more of the.
Okay, I think we're gonna go with proof of work, if that's
All
okay.
right, sure. So we have a chapter in the book, or we had a chapter in the book on Bitcoin mining and energy use and security, and then after revisions that became 2 chapters, because I think at least right now in our current climate, this is the most popular objection to Bitcoin. One of the reasons that it's so popular, and this is for me to commit the genetic fallacy, but I'll do it anyway. One of the reasons this objection is so popular is because the founder and CEO of a rival cryptocurrency paid $5 million to an environmentalist group to start saying that proof of work is bad and to use their extensive climate platform to rail against it. That person is Chris Larsen, and the rival cryptocurrency is XRP, which is the native token of the Ripple network. And he donated $5 million to Greenpeace USA. And then shortly after that, Greenpeace started this Change the Code campaign, saying that proof of work is bad and that Bitcoin should shift to proof of stake. And so there's a lot one could talk about it by way of responding to this objection. The first thing to say is you could concede and say, yes, proof of work is bad. It's doing terrible things. However, it's necessary for Bitcoin, and Bitcoin does a lot of good for people around the world who are living under authoritarianism or high inflation. And so even though it's bad, it's worth it. Then they might say, well, couldn't you get all the same good things from Bitcoin that uses some other consensus mechanism? Proof of stake, for example, which is the switch that Ethereum made just a year or so ago. They switched from a proof of work consensus mechanism to a proof of stake, and their energy use went down 99.7% or something like that. And I think there, the answer is no. Bitcoin couldn't continue to do what it does by being a proof of stake network. One reason that it couldn't is because, or the main reason that it couldn't is because of the permissionless way that Bitcoin miners enter the system and exit the system. So all that it takes to acquire Bitcoin without purchasing it is to start solving computer problems and win a block reward, and then you get some Bitcoin. The only way to enter a proof of stake network is to buy some of the token from someone that already has it. So maybe I'll talk just briefly about the difference between proof of work and proof of stake, but proof of work uses a electricity and hardware to solve a problem and get a reward. Proof of stake systems use the cryptocurrency that is the native asset of the blockchain, which people then sort of put up as collateral for the right to become a validator. And then there's a sort of probabilistic mechanism that chooses for each block who the validator is going to be. And so in Bitcoin, you risk wasting energy and thus money and hardware if you try to attack the network. And in proof of stake networks, you risk the native asset that you've put up for collateral. If you try to attack the network, you lose that, and so you lose money. So both of them incentivize honesty, but they do it in different ways. And so one of the differences is because you can't get a Bitcoin miner or an Ethereum miner and then acquire Ethereum that way, you have to buy into the network. So it's permissioned. Someone who already has some has to agree to give it to you or sell it to you. And Bitcoin doesn't work like that. Everyone in the network could hate you and not want you, and they could specifically say, we are not going to let that person ever get any Bitcoin. They could all agree, and they could be powerless to stop you. If that happens in Ethereum, you just don't ever get any Ethereum. The second reason is that proof of stake networks have inherent rich get richer effects. The larger amount you stake, the more likely it is that you'll get more. And if you then stake that more, the more likely it is that you'll get more. And so it balloons upwards in this kind of way. It also resists. So Bitcoin mining is kind of like that, in that the more Bitcoin you have, if you exchange it for miners, then the more Bitcoin you can acquire. But Bitcoin has this built-in entropy because miners break down. And so you're exchanging your Bitcoin for something that is going to lose value as time goes on. Whereas with Ethereum, the more you get, the more you have, and the more you can keep staking. And at no point is there any sort of degradation in your holdings. You never have to exchange it for something that's going to make it less valuable. And so for that reason, proof of stake networks don't work in the way that Bitcoin does in terms of permission or in terms of fairness of the playing field. They also would make it the case, if Bitcoin switched to proof of stake, that it wouldn't function as resistance money. Ethereum has trusted validators and Bitcoin has none. So when you connect your full node to the Bitcoin network for the first time, which you'll all do in the next couple of weeks, I imagine, your node will look for the chain with the most accumulated proof of work. And it can figure that out based on the values of the target difficulties and how much probabilistically how much energy it took to create this chain. And it'll start at the Genesis block and move forward. And if you see a block with a double spend, that is where someone tries to spend Bitcoin and then roll the block back and try to spend it again, you can figure out which of those two chains is the canonical chain based on which one has the most work. And only one of them will be canonical. With Ethereum, if you connect to the Ethereum network at a time in which a double spend is occurring, and you just have two validators, both of whom are legit validators, publishing a block, one has this transaction, one doesn't, and you're like, I don't know what to do. And your node doesn't know what to do either. And your only solution is to ask Vitalik which block is the right one. And then Vitalik will tell you, and then you'll accept that block. And that's how proof of stake validators handle attempted double spends. So if you think of Bitcoin as a solution to the double spending problem for digital cash, and you think of proof of work as the way of solving that problem, it's incredible that someone thought of this and was able to coordinate this kind of system. And that was like the holy grail of digital cash, was to solve this double spending problem. Proof of stake networks solve the problem with trust. And that was the explicit thing that, like, sentence 1 or 2 of the announcement that Satoshi sent out on the email list was specifically designed to get away from this. Proof of stake networks bring it right back. So there's a lot more to be said about mining and energy and electricity and what kind of energy is used for mining and whether proof of work might actually, save our entire energy grid and incentivize renewable energy build out and solve the climate crisis and all that stuff. But I won't get into that because you'll probably talk about that other times, and people who know more about mining and energy can talk more about that. So the way I think about it is proof of work is required for Bitcoin to function as resistance money, and it is good that Bitcoin exists so that it can function as resistance money, so we can't give up proof of work. And then if people are like, I don't think it's that great, then maybe you pivot to why don't you care about people living in authoritarianism? And if they just admit, like, I don't really care about them, then you can start talking about the positive externalities of Bitcoin mining. And I think the conversation there is really interesting. And but there's a lot of data there that I just don't know off the top of my head. So that's not what I'll talk. Questions about proof of work and proof of stake?
Not in here. But no, thank you for going over that, Bradley, because when I covered it, and yeah, I guess I consider that I sort of failed on how I first covered it, because I tried to do, explaining proof of work and then also all of the benefits from, build out of renewable infrastructure and whatnot. And I think, as you all found in your book, and then as I learned when I was trying to do the lessons, like, you really have to consider them in two different camps when you're explaining. So thank you, though, in this explanation, how you just, stuck to proof of work and, made that distinction much more clear. And I think fixed what I didn't do a great job of doing the first time around. So thank you.
I mean, these are hard, and I'm sure that everyone who explains this will get better over time as they try various explanations and they don't work. So I'll just spend a little bit of time on this. Bitcoin is right wing. You see this from Paul Krugman. There's a whole book called Bitcoin as Right Wing Extremism by David Columbia, published with the University of Minnesota Press. And I think there's two questions. One is about the origin of Bitcoin, and one is about the current system. So the origin of Bitcoin is by no means right-wing. Bitcoin came out of the cypherpunk movement. The cypherpunks were not politically aligned around anything except the importance of privacy. And the person who coined the term cypherpunk, Judith Milhone, was arrested at civil rights protests in the 60s and was famous for thinking that hacking was a feminist issue, that women might not be as physically strong as men, but they were smarter. And so if we gave them modems and keyboards, then they could make their strength felt through the internet. And so that's where Bitcoin came from. It did not come from any sort of right-wing ideology. And then currently, is Bitcoin actually right-wing? You see people like my Senator Cynthia Lummis, who is pretty far on the right end of the political spectrum. And you see very few people who are on the far left end of the political spectrum. That's not to say that they don't exist. There are plenty of us. But you see mostly the face of Bitcoin being right-wing. But when you actually look at the technology, I think Bitcoin is just anti-authoritarian technology. And plenty of right-wing authoritarians like Erdogan and Orban and those types of people are anti-Bitcoin as well. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, etc. So the way Bitcoin is currently used as present, I think, is not right-wing. It didn't come from a right-wing. So even though you see this a lot, I just think there's no evidence for it. And the Columbia book, it was written a while ago, so he didn't know how Bitcoin would continue to be used. But he's just wrong about the history, and I think he's obviously wildly wrong about the present situation. So we don't have tons of time, but that, I think it's worth bringing up this objection because I see it a lot, and I think in university contexts we see it even more than in popular level contexts. So it's worth explicitly addressing and saying there's just no evidence for this at all. And if anything, saying that Bitcoin is right-wing keeps people on the left from being involved in Bitcoin, and it kind of ensures that it will remain right-wing. And so if this is really a problem, then what you should be doing is encouraging more people who aren't right-wing to get into Bitcoin. But you never see that. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that. Questions about the Bitcoin's political alignment, or any other objections that you want to talk about that I didn't cover? That was my last one.
You'll have. So Bradley, I have kind of a generic question, which maybe I'll try asking in two ways, because I'm not sure if there's exactly an answer. But I guess one, there's lots and lots of different objections as you've shown today, and then in your book. Does there exist for you kind of a good framework to productively engage in objections? Like someone presents you with, I have this objection. Is there kind of a, I don't know, like a step-by-step process in your mind that you go through of how to engage that, like either with word choice or other tools? And then I guess maybe perhaps similarly, do you have almost like an elevator pitch to deal with objections generally, or I don't know, a different framework?
Not the answer to both questions is not really, because they're very different from each other. So I have an elevator pitch for specific objections that you just hear so much, like the mining objection, or the right-wing objection, or the Ponzi scheme objection. But there's a lot out there, and I don't think you can always apply the same kind of formula to them. So the first thing I try to do is figure out, what is this person really against? How do they think Bitcoin is connected to the thing that they're against? Are they right? And if they're not right, how do I try to show that they're not right? And sometimes they are right. I mean, people who there are people who think that physical cash should be abolished because the government should be able to track all spending. That's the only way that we can, fight back against terrorism or something like that. So I think someone like that is never going to become pro-Bitcoin. And I probably wouldn't want them to be. There are certain people that I don't want associated with Bitcoin. And so, but if I think they're wrong, then it's going to be different as to how I respond to it. Someone who thinks that Bitcoin is directly responsible for climate change I'm going to respond differently than someone who thinks that Bitcoin is directly responsible for terrorist attacks, or that Bitcoin is directly responsible for, I don't know, something about Ponzi schemes. Those are all kind of different.
Yeah. And I guess so an objection that maybe I would present to hear your answer that I have heard most commonly just on university campuses from students, professors everywhere, and it's blockchain's the true innovation, not Bitcoin. It was the first, and there's so much more better. So what's your elevator pitch for that? Or, you can expand more.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing I do is ask a question. What's so great about blockchain? And a lot of people don't know, because they don't even know what that means. They've just heard it before and like, oh, blockchains are great. So people who don't know, I say, blockchains are really good at one thing, which is coordinating a ledger among people who might be trying to cheat each other. That's basically the reason that a blockchain came into existence. A lot of people don't know Bitcoin was the first blockchain. They think that like Bitcoin is one of the ones that came along. So that's why Satoshi invented blockchains. If you are not worried about people cheating, then there's no reason to use a blockchain. It is just computationally intensive and wasteful. If you could just do it on a spreadsheet that everyone has edit access to, or at least suggesting access to. So what are the kinds of things that are important to have or track on a blockchain? Well, so here's another thing. There's a great essay by a philosopher. So one of the like 6 philosophers in the world who think about Bitcoin and blockchain kind of stuff, named Martin Glaser. He wrote a paper. I don't think it's ever been published, but then he wrote an op-ed in CoinDesk. And the title, I think, is something like Enterprise Blockchain Fails Because It's About the Real World. And his main idea is that the cool thing about the Bitcoin blockchain is that it's impossible that it be wrong. If the Bitcoin blockchain says that an address has a certain balance at it, that's just what it means for that address to have that balance. But if a blockchain says that there's sort of a cow in a certain parcel of land, it could be wrong because cows move. And if it says that a certain storage container is filled with a certain amount of stuff, it could be wrong because people could have broken in and stolen it. So what you need there is a blockchain to correspond to the real world, and there's no way to guarantee that it always will. And then any way to try to guarantee that allows someone to have authority over what's happening on the blockchain. So the kinds of things that blockchain is good for is things that it can't possibly be wrong about. And that is, money and maybe voting. And that's about it. So if you wanted to put a voting system on a blockchain to guarantee that it would be very, very costly for someone to try to cheat the voting system, they'd have to use a lot of energy and money for only a small chance of success. I'm kind of amenable to that. I'd want to see exactly how it worked out. But basically anything else, it's just not useful for. So that's one response. And then the other response is, yeah, blockchain's great. I love blockchain. Blockchain is a super cool innovation. One of the coolest innovations in blockchain technology is with money. Have you heard of Bitcoin? Bitcoin is the perfect way to use blockchain for money. So people who love blockchain, they can be brought back around to Bitcoin by realizing that blockchain is really great for tracking the movements of money.
That's great. Thank you. Anyone on Zoom, do you all have any questions? Or I want to be respectful of time too. Better anyone person? No. Well, Bradley, just thank you so much for walking us through all of these and providing all these tools to think about, how to handle objections. And yes, everyone should read your book.
Yeah. So we, for a very brief amount of time, had the #1 best-selling philosophy book on Amazon. I think after a Lynn Alden blurb she published. But yeah, if you want to hear more about the 20 or so objections that we didn't cover, you can read the book and also the positive case.
Yes.
And let me pop in the chat. Does the chat get saved along with this for people who?
It does. And also I was going to go back and if you're getting the live stream link for your talk earlier this week, it's going to ask you for that anyways. So I can include it in like the email that goes out and Twitter and such, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. And I'm sure that the book will pop back up to #1. I'm reading it right now and it's really incredible. So I think when it comes out in June, right? Is that when you can get the physical copy?
June 14th is
June 14th.
the official publication date.
Okay.
And there's the, yes.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. Got it.
There's the live stream of the talk. And yeah, I'll be at Cheat Code in Bedford in a week or so, or a couple weeks, and the Bitcoin Policy Summit is coming up in Washington, D.C. That last year at least was live streamed by, I think, on the Swan Bitcoin channel. But I learn a ton at those because it's miners and human rights advocates and policymakers and people like that talking about Bitcoin. So that's the 9th, I think April 9th, all day. So
well,
yeah.
4 of us will be there. So we're excited to meet you in
No
person.
way. Awesome. Which 4 of you? You and 3 others. Sal, oh, nice.
And then Ryan. Yeah. So it'll be
Awesome.
great to meet you in person.
Cool. Yeah, we'll hang out.
Yes.
Great.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Bradley.
You're
So
welcome.
nice to have you and just thank you again.
Happy to do it anytime.
Thanks. Bye.
Take care.
And then for the others, if you want to stay, I just had a couple news updates. But Bradley, you're welcome. Yeah, hop off whenever. Okay, so sorry, I'm gonna go through this so quickly, but this is just important and relevant to what we were talking about today. So Bradley briefly brought up FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. Anyways, today he was officially found guilty on all of the criminal counts. Or he already was, but now he was sentenced to 25 years. And I put some info on here. But actually, I think it's more important to also acknowledge Ross Ulbright in this story. So I put in a couple links. This one, I'm going to click on it so we can all see it. It's really good, but it basically goes through his entire story. So basically he created Silk Road. It's a global marketplace to buy and sell goods. And, not entirely legal on there, but he was sentenced to, I think, 2 terms of life in prison. And if you compare the crimes, just very unjust sentences, like what came out. So I wanted to make sure his story was at least present in our meeting for today and encourage you all to go read that. And then, Bradley talked a lot about Bitcoin as resistance money and how it protects your freedom. So this is from the Financial Freedom Report from HRF from this week, but Iran has a new in their parliament, they passed a law. So basically they can look on AI or I think they're using AI and basically see if a woman is not following the correct regulations and then just debit the bank accounts. So directly go in, just steal the money. So, we were talking about this earlier and wanted to give a real world example of it happening. Okay, so I know we're 15 minutes over, so I'll let everyone go. But thank you so much, everybody, and have a good spring break. See you all.